Well, friends, on behalf of San Marino Community Church, I wanted to say welcome to this Sunday afternoon series, this 2-week series on Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln in Private, Wisdom for Today. My name is Pastor Eric Wiebe. I'm the Associate Pastor of Spiritual Formation and Pastoral Care here at San Marino Community Church. And we're really glad to see you all here and to be gathered around this very important topic for today. And I wanted to give an introduction to Ron. We all know him as a wonderfully warm and collegial person, but he is also a highly esteemed scholar. And so as we do, I would love to offer these words of introductions that Ronald C. White's book, Lincoln in Private, What His Most Personal Reflections Tell Us About Our Greatest President, is the recipient of the 2021 Baroness Lincoln awarded by the Civil War Roundtable of New York for the greater appreciation of the life and work of Abraham Lincoln. The Wall Street Journal hailed it as an intimate character portrait and fascinating inquiry into the basis of Lincoln's energetic, curious mind, end quote. Ron is the author of 2 New York Times best-selling presidential biographies, A. Lincoln, a biography, and American Ulysses, a life of Ulysses S. Grant. He has also written Lincoln's Greatest Speech, the second inaugural, a New York Times notable book, and The Eloquent President, a portrait of Lincoln through his words, a Los Angeles Times bestseller. Ron has spoken on Lincoln in England, in France, Germany, Italy, Mexico, and New Zealand. San Marino Community Church is honored to have Ron White as our scholar in residence. So in a world full of extraordinary challenge, friends, please join me in welcoming Ron White to speak on Abraham Lincoln, Wisdom for Today.
Welcome to our Super Bowl party. Our pre-party, pardon me. Refreshments are over there. 2 weeks ago, Abraham Lincoln's birthday is today. That was my extra credit question in both worship services. It's probably a generational answer, is it not? That I'm afraid that young people do not know that this is Abraham Lincoln's birthday. It is a legal holiday in the state of Illinois, a legal public holiday, but not in California.
Happy birthday to him.
We could sing happy birthday to him. 2 weeks ago, I was speaking in Honolulu, and 2 people arrived who were both lawyers from Hamburg, Germany. It reminded me of a remarkable story to illustrate how Lincoln is revered around the world. In 2009, I received a call from the United States State Department asking if I would be willing to speak in Germany. Europeans, including Germans, were staying away from American embassies and consulates because of their disapproval of our war in Iraq. And with a new president, Barack Obama, they said, we have a chance, we think, to bring people back to our embassies. And we want to start with soft diplomacy. So I said, well, what is soft diplomacy? They said, Abraham Lincoln. So I was invited to speak to the consulate or embassy, I can't forget which it was, in Hamburg, to the University of Münster, and then to the American University in Berlin, which is the largest American university outside of the United States with the greatest library. So I spoke in Hamburg to 12th and 13th grade teachers teaching English and history. And after they asked me a number of questions, I asked them a question. I said, well, tell me, I said, why are you so interested in Lincoln? And they said, well, we know American history, and by goodness they do. And we know the story of George Washington and the story of Thomas Jefferson. But she said, those are figures like people in our history. They're aristocrats. For us, Abraham Lincoln is America. He starts with nothing. And he says we all have the right to rise. So for us, when we think of America, we think of Abraham Lincoln. I've never forgotten that answer. And these two lawyers in Hamburg told me, that's right. When we think of America, we think of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is number one in the 4 C-SPAN presidential historian polls that have taken place in the 21st century. A poll is done every time there's a transition from one president to the next. He's always ranked number one. I call that in a sense, the public Lincoln. The Lincoln who won the Civil War, who gave the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural, I think the 2 greatest addresses in the history of America. What I want to talk about this afternoon and what I've written about is what I call the private Lincoln. The Lincoln who is not very well known, who is a very unusual person. Let's refresh our memories. Lincoln was born in 1809 in Kentucky, raised in Kentucky and southern Indiana. Remarkably, he had only 1 year at most of formal education. Boys were afforded education only in January and February when it was too cold to work with their fathers on the family farms. And families would hire itinerant teachers who would come through, and they'd hire these teachers to teach their sons for 6 or 7 or 8 weeks. And we know that Lincoln maybe did that 5, possibly 6 times. He had 1 year of formal education. It's just incredible to me. Cynthia, my wife, knows that I sometimes wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking about Abraham Lincoln. I find him just such an ultimately amazing and fascinating person. My curiosity about him never stops. But let's this afternoon talk about Lincoln in private. It was the spring of 1863, and Abraham Lincoln faced a chorus of critics. The Civil War was going on and on. When the war began, the North thought they would win the war very quickly in 3, 4, 5, 6 months, for they had more than twice as many men in arms and a much greater industrial foundation beneath that army. And yet here we were now, and the war goes on and on. It was beginning to be called Mr. Lincoln's War. So in 1863, a group arose who called themselves Peace Democrats. They wanted the war to end and the nation to be returned as it was. As it was meant with slavery. They were called Copperheads by their opponents because they were snakes accusing and rallying against Lincoln. One rally took place in Albany, New York. And after the rally, they did what often rallies did. They came up with a set of resolutions criticizing Lincoln. And they sent the resolutions to him. And he had a habit of responding to these kind of protests by writing what was called at the time a public letter. And he would push this letter into a Washington newspaper, which would then be circulated across the country. So as he sat in his office to write one of these public letters, young Congressman James Wilson of Iowa entered the office. He watched Lincoln writing at his desk, and he was quite impressed. He said, "It's amazing that you could sit down and write from scratch one of these great public letters." And Lincoln said, "Oh, no, no, no." And he pointed to an open desk drawer. He said, "I had it all nearly in there." He said, "That's where I keep my best thoughts on the subject." Well, Lincoln kept his best thoughts on the subject in those notes in his top drawer. They didn't escape him, but they've escaped us. Strangely, ironically, paradoxically, across the years, these notes were put into all the different publications of his letters and diaries and letters and public speeches. His 2 secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay, published 10 volumes in 1900. Another series was published in the 1950s, and they were often called sometimes fragments, because Lincoln would write these notes and they ended in the middle of a sentence or even in the middle of a word with no punctuation at the end. Because why? You've had this happen to you, have you not? You've written something down. He was called away by some urgent matter and he never finished them. So as I thought about this, and I've written 3 previous books on Lincoln, I contacted the Springfield, Illinois, where they're doing a new volume of Lincoln Papers. For the first time, it'll be on the internet, not published in book form. They're actually having like the incoming correspondence. What was a letter coming into Lincoln that he responds to? And I said, well, how many of these do you think we still have? They said, we have 111. 111 have survived from what I think were hundreds and hundreds that he wrote. They had 110. One was still held in the hands of a private collector in Dallas, Texas. Fortunately for me, I had been in that private collector's home twice. He, a very wealthy man, had built an extension to his home, larger than most of our homes, with a full-time private curator. And he had bought this fragment, which we're going to talk about this afternoon, and I asked him if I could have, Harlan Crow, could I have permission to use this fragment in my book? And he gave that permission. So Lincoln in private. I believe that these notes, these fragments, give us a perception of a person not fully revealed in the public Lincoln. Do you ever have the question that I do, who is this person behind the teleprompter that is speaking to us? Who is this actor or actress in their private life as opposed to their public life? Sometimes we find out what that private life is and we wish we didn't know. But who is the private person? Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon, said of Lincoln, he is the most shut-mouthed man I have ever met in my life. Why was that? Let's rehearse his biography. Let's refresh our memories. Born in 1809 in Kentucky and then in southern Indiana, he grew up in what was called the Second Great Awakening. His parents attended Baptist churches. They were very, very emotional in their Christian faith. Lincoln, even as a young boy, did not like this emotion. He would get out of the church service on Sunday morning at age 9, and he'd stand up on a stump of a tree and began to repeat the minister's sermons, almost word for word with all the gesticulations that must have gone on in that service until his father hit him on the backside and told him to get on home. So Lincoln then did what some of you have done, or your children have done, or your grandchildren have done. He rejected the Christian faith. When he moved at age 21 to New Salem, Illinois, outside of Springfield, we have many witnesses to this. He wrote a paper criticizing revealed religion, criticizing the Bible. He was already an aspiring politician, and so someone in that crowd took that paper, took it out of his hand, and tossed it into the fire. This is not a smart thing to do for an aspiring politician, to attack Orthodox Christianity. But then, as I like to say, life tumbled in, as it will and has for all of us. First, it was the death of Eddie, age 3.5 in 1850. Then it was the death of Willie, age 11 in 1862. And as life tumbled in, as 750,000 men died in the Civil War, we thought it was only 619, but now we know it's 750,000. If that war took place today, a nation of 35 million, that would have meant there would have been 75 million would have died. I don't know a single person who died in the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. Everybody knew someone who had died in the Civil War. So the story goes forward, and Lincoln has to rethink his faith. We'll see that especially next Sunday. He can't go back, as some of us can't go back, to our childhood or our teenage faith. He has to find something that is more thoughtful and more rational. He finds it first in the First Presbyterian Church of Springfield, Illinois. But he's out on the 8th Judicial Circuit, often away from Springfield 175 days a year, so he's not very active. But when he comes to Washington, lots of churches offer him a free pew. You had to buy your pew to sit in church on those days. He joins the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. And Phineas Densmore Gurley, the pastor of that church, number 1 in his class at Princeton Seminary, becomes a huge mentor, I believe, to Abraham Lincoln, and is the missing person in that story. So Lincoln rethinks his faith. This afternoon, I want to talk about 3 fragments. Let's see, get the first one here. I'm so grateful to the publisher, because the publisher very gratefully to me published these fragments in color. Not an easy thing to do. And the first one I want to bring to our attention is the fragment on his visit to Niagara Falls. The year is 1848. By the way, there's one fragment from the 1830s. I think he wrote many more, but if you think about it, here's a guy who, when he gets to New Salem, he sleeps in the back room of the store, or he boards with families 1 month at a time. Not an easy way to hold on to the notes that you've written. Even when he runs for Congress, he stays in a boarding house in Washington, D.C. So the fragments are not one in 1830s, 7 in 1840s, and then they pick up in 1850s as he re-enters politics and really is outraged by the extension of slavery. But in 1848, he's a member of Congress. It's the end of his first year in Congress, and he goes to Boston to campaign for the then Whig, the predecessor of Republicans, presidential candidate. On the way home, he says, let's all go, by all, he meant his family, to Niagara Falls. Now, in the first decades of the 19th century, America felt a real inferiority complex to England and Europe. We didn't have their culture. We didn't have their authors. We didn't have their artists. We didn't have their musicians. But what we did have, and they never would have, is the beauty of our national parks. This wasn't Yosemite, not yet. It wasn't Yellowstone. It wasn't Glacier. It was Niagara Falls. And people came from all over the world. They came from Europe to see Niagara Falls. This was the most amazing geographical monument to what America was all about, the beauty of our nature. This was really special. So Lincoln goes to Niagara Falls with Mary and with his children, and while he's there, he writes this fragment. You can see it on our screens. Maybe it's a little small to read, but you can also see that Lincoln, as people in the 19th century, they had wonderful handwriting. I'm finishing a biography on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top at Gettysburg, which will be published on October 31st, and I found his penmanship book. He practiced over and over and over and over again his cursive writing, so that these people in the 19th century had this beautiful, beautiful cursive writing. This was so important to them. Let's read a little of this Niagara Falls and try to get a sense of what Lincoln is all about. Niagara Falls, by what mysterious power is it that millions and millions are drawn from all parts of the world to gaze upon Niagara Falls? There is no mystery about the thing itself. Every effect is just such as any intelligent man, knowing the causes, would anticipate without seeing it. If the water moving forward in a great river reaches a point where there is a perpendicular jog of 100 feet in descent in the bottom of the river, it is plain the water will have a violent and continuous plunge at that point. Lincoln was kind of a pseudo-engineer. He had kind of worked on the Sangamon River in Illinois because he thought that if you could navigate these rivers, you could take local agricultural products and transport them long distances. As a 19-year-old, he went from Indiana to New Orleans, and there he stood aghast as he saw on one side African-American men, on the other side African-American women with their children. Marriage was not legal among slaves, and he was horrified by what he saw. He never forgot that scene. Well, he goes on kind of as a historian, as a geologist, environmentalist. I'm going to not read all of it, but I want to get to the end of it because I think this says so much about Lincoln. But still there is more. It calls up the indefinite past, when Columbus first sought this continent, when Christ suffered on the cross, when Moses led Israel through the Red Sea, nay, even when Adam first came from the hand of his Maker, then as now, Niagara was roaring here. The eyes of that species of extinct giants whose bones fill the mounds of America have gazed on Niagara, as ours do now. Contemporary with the whole race of men and older than the first man, Niagara is strong and fresh today as 10,000 years ago. The mammoth and the mastodon, now so long dead that fragments of their monstrous bones alone testify, that they ever lived have gazed on Niagara. And then this remarkable concluding sentence, which doesn't have a period, it only has a comma. I think he was called away by his children to do something. In that long, long time, never for a single moment, never dried, never froze, never slept, never rested. One reason people went to Niagara was just a few years before, because of the particular climate change, so to speak, the falls stopped. They stopped. And suddenly everything was open. And people rushed down to the bed of the river, and they found Indian artifacts and all kinds of things. And for about 18 hours, the falls stopped. And then they started up again, and people ran away to get out of the force of those falls. Well, I said that Lincoln had a law partner named William Herndon. And after Lincoln's death, Herndon began to interview people, and then he began to give lectures on Lincoln. And he suggested to everyone that he knew Lincoln better than anyone else because he had been his junior law partner. So when Lincoln comes back from Niagara Falls, Herndon had also recently been to Niagara Falls. So Herndon writes this about his law partner. He had no eye for the magnificence and grandeur of the scene, for the rapids, the mist, the angry waters, and the roar of the whirlpool. Lincoln, according to Herndon, was heedless of beauty or awe. He did not know the private Lincoln. He didn't know Lincoln as he thought he knew Lincoln. Lincoln understood the beauty of Niagara Falls. I call this the lyrical Lincoln, because out of that experience as a boy in the Second Great Awakening, he determined that he would become a rational person, that he would not give himself into kind of the emotionalism, even the romanticism of the age. And yet here, unlike almost anything else, anything in his public speech, is this beautiful lyrical description of who he is. A second fragment. Lincoln spent 24 years as a lawyer and only 14 years as an elected politician. Most often, people became lawyers and then became politicians. Still true today. He became a politician and then was encouraged by John Stuart, the foremost lawyer in Springfield, to become a lawyer. In those days, there were only a few law schools, only 2 in the western United States, so there was no law school for him to attend. And I enjoy saying this to any lawyers in the crowd, wherever you are, that to become a lawyer was not simply passing some test. It was about your moral character. It was about your moral character. So the first time a year ago, I had the privilege, first time of speaking to a law school. I was invited to speak to the Baylor University School of Law. And that was a very interesting experience to speak to the law school students in Waco, Texas. And I focused on this particular fragment. Very, very interesting. Lincoln became a very well-known lawyer, and what he did was not simply practice in Springfield, which was the capital of Illinois, but he practiced in what was called the 8th Judicial Circuit. This was a geographical area in central Illinois as large as the state of Connecticut, as large as the state of Connecticut. And he would go out twice a year, about 90 days each time, practicing law, riding his old horse Bob, or going in a buggy, and he just enjoyed this experience. And this is where he learned to talk with common people and to practice law. Now, if you wanted to be a lawyer, and Lincoln did read law with John Stuart, what you wanted to do was to apprentice yourself sort of, I'd like to read law with Abraham Lincoln. But Lincoln wasn't at home to read law with, and he realized that there was no way he was going to sit around in Springfield and have all these aspiring young lawyers come and study with him. So he'd give a lecture on law. He'd give a lecture on law. This lecture is so remarkable. This is the way it begins. I am not an accomplished lawyer. He was the most accomplished lawyer in the state of Illinois. Can you imagine any college president, any lawyer, any politician beginning, "I am not"? No, of course not. This is the next sentence, even more remarkable. "I find quite as much material for a lecture in those points where I have failed as in those wherein I have been moderately successful." I find as much material in those points where I have failed, in those where I have been moderately successful. To me, this is the heart and soul of Lincoln, the ability to admit his failure, to understand that you can learn from failure, but also that you can admit your failure in public. The leading rule for the lawyer, as for the man of every other calling, is diligence. Leave nothing for tomorrow which can be done today. Never let your correspondence or your email or your texts, no, I didn't say that, fall behind. Lincoln had a great sense for the community of these small towns in Illinois. And he was very worried about the phrase that was current then of "let's everyone go to law, go to law." He tried to say to people that if you win the lawsuit, you might win by the judge or the jury, but you're going to lose your friends and your neighbors. So he wanted his second law partner, his mentor, said, discourage litigation. This is what he says. Discourage litigation. Persuade your neighbors to compromise whenever you can. Point out to them how the nominal winner is often the real loser in fees, expenses, and waste of time. As a peacemaker, the lawyer has a superior opportunity of being a good man. Let me say that again. As a peacemaker, the lawyer has a superior opportunity of being a good man. Now, Lincoln was a very good war president. He actually checked books out of the Library of Congress to teach himself how to be a war president. That's in our Constitution, but it's very undefined. I mean, James Polk had to be a war president in the war with Mexico, and now Lincoln has to be a war president in the Civil War. But he was looking forward to a second term because he thought he would be a much better peace president than he was a war president. He was assassinated 41 days after he was inaugurated for a second term. As a peacemaker, the lawyer has a superior opportunity of being a good man. There will still be business enough. And then this final paragraph. There is a vague popular belief that lawyers are necessarily dishonest. I say vague because when we consider to what extent confidence and honors are reposed in and conferred upon lawyers by the people, it appears improbable that their impression of dishonesty is very distinct and vivid. Yet the impression is common, almost universal. He wants to defend the calling of the lawyer. Let no man choosing the law for a calling for a moment yield to the popular belief. Resolve to be honest at all events, and if in your own judgment you cannot be an honest lawyer, resolve to be honest without being a lawyer. Choose some other occupation rather than the one in choosing of which you do in advance consent to be a knave. We have no evidence that he ever gave this lecture. I've been often asked, as a very fair question, did these notes to himself, were they kind of the grist for writing a speech? There's almost none of them ever appear in speeches. I think this is kind of Lincoln's intellectual thinking to himself. He's not doing this, well, then I'll translate this, I'll just copy it and put it into my next speech. No, this is the way he's thinking to himself. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we elected politicians who were thoughtful, who were good readers? I mean, Jefferson was in love with Jefferson. Lincoln was in love with Jefferson, with Franklin, with Washington. He revered the founders, and he knew all about them. He was a well-read person. When he comes back from that single term in Congress, his law partner, William Herndon, says to him, well, he said, I think we should begin to subscribe to some of the anti-slavery newspapers that are national newspapers. Lincoln was anti-slavery. And Lincoln said, well, that's a very good idea. What do you recommend? And Herndon recommends 2 papers that were published in Washington, D.C. And then Lincoln says to Herndon, I think we should also subscribe to the leading newspaper in Richmond, Virginia, and Charleston, South Carolina. And Herndon says, well, why would we do that? He said, because we need both sides at the table. We need both sides at the table. Lincoln, and you see this in his notes, he wanted to hear, he wanted to understand what the other side, what with people he did not agree with, what they thought and what they wrote, so that he would fully understand it. Often, and I say this when I've taught college and university students, we criticize which we have not taken the time to understand. You have no right to criticize any other person until you've taken the time to understand what they're really attempting to say. Well, let's move to a third. Here we are. This is the most amazing one of all, I think. It's hard to say that. There's so many great ones. This is the one owned by Harlan Crow in Dallas, Texas. Lincoln, in his one term in Congress, takes a very strong stand against the United States war with Mexico. He's very young. He stands on the floor of Congress. Congress was really, the way Congress worked in the 19th century was, this was only in effect from December to March, because then you had to go home and plant the crops. Then you had to go home and tend to what you did. So you only were in Congress for 4 months a year. So he comes in December and he stands up and says to James Polk, I want you to tell me the spot on which the Mexicans invaded America. I am very convinced that America invaded Mexico, or that America tricked the Mexicans into invading us. And he says to Polk, you remember, you sit where George Washington sat, and you need to be honest about this. So Lincoln is now called Spotty Lincoln. Spotty Lincoln, tell me the spot. He comes home. This is not the thing you do to criticize the President of the United States. And a lot of even his friends say, thank you very much, Mr. Lincoln. I don't think you're going to ever be elected to politics again. And he thought that would be the case. So he becomes a full-time lawyer from 1849, the end of his first term, to 1854. But in 1854, Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois, puts into position the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act suggested that although we can't do anything with slavery where it already exists, the Constitution doesn't permit us, we can extend slavery, continue it to go west. So Kansas and Nebraska were then territories much, much larger than today's states. And Lincoln hears this, and he is furious. He comes roaring out of his legal profession. Is it possible that you could vote to have slavery in a territory or state? Stephen Douglas lifts up what he calls popular sovereignty, that people ought to be able in Kansas or Nebraska to vote whether they wanted slavery or not. And Lincoln said, you can vote on something as immoral as that? You can vote for it, and that makes it okay? So Lincoln roars out of his legal practice and begins to participate again in politics. But he holds his fire. He wants to be sure of his thought. We don't hold our fire anymore in a 24/7 news cycle. What do you think? Well, this happened 5 minutes ago, but what do you think? No, Lincoln would take his time for months. When the awful Dred Scott decision was made, that Dred Scott had no standing before the United States Supreme Court, I once was asked to speak to the federal court of which John Roberts is a member. And Chief Justice Roberts was asked, what is the worst decision ever made by the United States Supreme Court? He said, Dred Scott. Dred Scott. The idea that this African-American man is property and not a person. So Lincoln holds his fire. You'll notice if you are looking in this book that almost all of these fragments or notes have a question mark after them. We don't know the exact date because Lincoln never dated them. He never dated them. He never titled them. He never signed them, but we know they're Lincoln by his distinctive handwriting. I should say that some of the ones when he became president are dated and signed. Let's look at this one together. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may of right enslave B, Why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? Ah, you say A is white and B is black. It is color. And Lincoln underlines key words, so he underlines the word color. It is color, then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker. Take care. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. Lincoln is a master of deductive reasoning. Ah, you do not mean color exactly. You mean whites are intellectually the superiors to blacks, and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But you say it's a question of interest, and he really sort of means economic interest. And if you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. And if he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. Wow, I'm just blown away by this kind of thinking and writing. This never appears in any speech he gives. He gives many, many speeches about slavery, 7 debates with Stephen Douglas. Never appears. I think Lincoln is working this thing out in his own mind. And Lincoln, the lawyer, I think, comes into play here because the lawyer, the good lawyer, has to understand the point of view of the other side. If you don't understand the point of the other side, you can't understand your own point of view. So many of these notes will start with the other side, with pro-slavery, with all of these arguments. Birth of the Republican Party. Well, the Republican Party birthed in 1854, 1855. It's a sectional party. It'll never be meant to anything. It'll never be a national party. So he starts with that. So, well, let's say it is it a sectional party or is it a national party? Lincoln is just a genius with that. Let me do one more here, and 1 or 2 more that I'll read, and we'll open it up for your comments and questions. In 1855, and actually 1856, Lincoln wanted to be, that was his greatest aspiration in life, to become a United States Senator. Until 1912, United States Senators were elected by state legislatures. This is how they ran. And Lincoln was very hopeful that he would be elected for the first time ever. Usually you just appeared at the legislature and they voted, but the Republicans, the new Republican Party, had a convention in Springfield and nominated Lincoln as their candidate. So Lincoln was very hopeful, and he led on the first ballot, and the second, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth, but he couldn't quite get to that magic number where he had enough votes. At the same time, the Democrats were running their various candidates, but they weren't getting anywhere either. And then Lincoln came to a judgment that his followers and friends didn't agree with. He said, I can't win this election. What's important is whoever wins this election must be against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, must be against the extension of slavery. Who might that person be? Well, I think we ought to shift our votes to Lyman Trumbull. Lyman Trumbull, he's a Democrat. I know he's a Democrat, but I don't like the Republican who's running because he's going to allow slavery to be extended. I'm going to switch my votes to Lyman Trumbull, a Democrat. He does, and Lyman Trumbull, a Democrat, is elected. So Lincoln publicly is, oh, everything is fine, you know, I'm okay, don't worry about me. The real loser in this is Stephen Douglas, who was the real initiator of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But privately, Lincoln says something quite different. 22 years ago, Stephen Douglas and I first became acquainted. We were both young then, he a trifle younger than I. Even then, we were both ambitious. Lincoln never denies his ambition. I perhaps quite as much as he. With me, he underlines me, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure. He would never have said that in public. He is expressing the deepest feelings of his life. With me, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure. In less than 4 years, you will be elected President of the United States. So what I've done in this book, and it's not been done before, is all 111 fragments are printed as an appendix. So you can read them all. I've taken 10 chapters to talk about 12 fragments. There's many more that are so interesting, so remarkable. And what do they tell us? They tell us that behind the public Lincoln, there's a private Lincoln. Behind the logical Lincoln, there's a lyrical Lincoln. We'll look next week behind the supposed idea, still very much abroad, that Lincoln was not a religious person, is a deeply Christian religious meditation that he writes 2.5 years before he gives the second inaugural address. So I think this opens up to us a photograph, a panorama, a picture of a person that even those of us who know Lincoln well, who have studied him, who respect him, who've read biographies of him, I don't think we've ever I had not fully captured who is this private person behind the public person. That's what I wanted to present to you this afternoon. Let's open it up now to your comments and questions. I'll repeat them so everybody can hear, and we are recording this. We made the decision that to encourage you to come, and you did, we would not do this online, but we would record it. So the person who told me this morning that he was going to the Los Angeles Philharmonic, I told him, good, you can watch it Tuesday evening. So your comments or questions, not simply about Lincoln in private, but whatever you want to ask about Lincoln. Come on now. Yeah.
I don't have a question about Lincoln, but I've been to other talks of yours, and you're so interesting, and you make us feel like we're meeting him as you have met him. What began this quest?
What began, the question is, she said, meeting Lincoln's like, well, I inhabit or try to. What happened was, I was teaching in the history department at UCLA. Some of you will remember in 1993, the Huntington Library put on a remarkable exhibit on Abraham Lincoln. At the time, it was the largest public exhibit ever in the United States. Many things were brought from Springfield, Illinois, and Louise Taper of Beverly Hills contributed her private collection. So I had the opportunity in the history department to offer a seminar of my choice. And I'm always looking for ways to get students involved. And I thought, well, I don't know very much about Lincoln, but I'll offer a seminar on Lincoln, and I'll bring them across from Westwood to San Marino to the Huntington Library. And I'll find someone there, not me. It was Paul Zoll, if you remember Paul Zoll, the great Paul Zoll. I'll ask him to give a lecture to the students. Well, it went very, very well. And so we ordered, as a textbook, an anthology. This interesting anthology, the elder Cuomo, who was then governor of New York, had invited some people from Poland to visit the United States as Poland was trying to find its own freedom and democracy. And they asked him, where should we turn to sort of refound our own country? He said, you ought to do it with Lincoln. He said, let me put together an anthology for you. Take this back to Poland. It was published in Polish and English, and use it. So the next year, we came a second time. And I started reading the anthology myself, and I was drawn to the second inaugural address where in 701 words, Lincoln mentions God 14 times, quotes the Bible 4 times, and invokes prayer 3 times. And my own faith made me attuned to this, and I thought, I'll find a book on the second inaugural. There wasn't one. There were 5 books on the Gettysburg Address, so I had the audacity to say, I think I'll write it. And at that moment, strange to me how things happen in our lives, a friend of mine at the Huntington, where we were having lunch, and he said, you can write for a larger audience. He said, most academics cannot. Could I introduce you to my literary agent in New York? I didn't know that world existed. So that began the quest to understand more about Lincoln. I felt so much a Johnny-come-lately. Who am I in my late 50s trying to understand Abraham Lincoln? But that's how it all began. Then when the Huntington extended its exhibit, they did for a longer time, The next year we went to the shrine at Redlands. If you haven't been there, that's a wonderful place to visit. It's very small. It's the only Lincoln shrine west of the Mississippi. It's attached to the A.K. Smiley Public Library in Redlands. A wonderful, wonderful place to visit. They have some fine documents. So I'm a believer that in writing biography, you have to write from the inside out. It's not what a person did, but it's a person who is. And I think my whole calling to be a minister helped me here, because what does a minister want to do? To understand people in their depth. Who are they? What are their feelings? What are their fears? So I don't think you could write this when you were 25 years old. You had to be older to write it. So that's how it all began. And I'm not kidding when I said I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, because I just keep thinking about this guy. I think, this is just an amazing person. Who is this person? I'm not saying at all that I figured that out, but it's a wonderful quest to try to figure it out. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I read this morning that there are 1,500 biographies of Lincoln, second only to Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I looked at those lists, the top 10, top 25. What I did not find in any of those lists was the 10 volumes by his personal secretaries, Nicholas and Hay. Why would that be?
Very, very good question and comment. The comment is that when he looked on the list, there were 1,500 biographies of Lincoln. But when he looked at the top 10 or the top 20, he didn't find the 10 volumes, or actually I think it's 7 volumes for the biography, of his secretaries, Nicolay and Hay. What happened when Lincoln was assassinated? His friend, Judge Davis, David Davis, who was then on the Supreme Court, immediately asked Nicolay and Hay, the two secretaries, to gather up all the papers and then ship him to him, and he put them in the bank in Bloomfield, Illinois, where Davis lived. But he knew that Nicolay and Hay wanted to write the biography, so they went off and did other things, but they came back to it. They had to pass through a number of filters. One of the filters was Robert, the only surviving son. Tad, the third son, died in 1868. I'm so sympathetic to Mary. A lot of people aren't. She's lost 3 of her sons, for goodness sakes, and her husband. But Robert wanted to safeguard his father's reputation. The other filter was the whole stature and meaning of the Republican Party at that time. So some people feel, I think I don't quite feel that way, that the 7 volumes are kind of tilted. They're not totally honest. They're too, isn't this man great sort of biography. They're not the way a modern biographer might write it. For example, the newest biography, which I very much like and was able to read in the draft status, is the one by John Meacham. And John Meacham, I think, in a wonderful way, tries to show all sides, the warts and all, so to speak. There aren't warts and all in those 7 volumes. Not to say that they're not valuable, because here are 2 young men. Hay was 22 years old when he started working for Lincoln. He would also ultimately become Secretary of State under Theodore Roosevelt in the beginning of the 20th century. I think they're very valuable, but that's probably why historians would not rank them in the top 10 or 20. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned his supporting the Democratic candidate.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the team of rivals?
Yes, yes. Could I talk a little bit about the team of rivals? Or what the preface to her question is, you talked about supporting the Democratic candidate. By the way, Lyman Trumbull ultimately became a Republican, but at that point he was a Democrat. Well, Doris Kearns Goodwin has a wonderful story of the fact that Lincoln takes his 3 leading contenders, all of whom, in a sense, were more experienced than he was, and he invites them into his cabinet. And why does he do that? Because he's so secure in his own self that he's willing to invite people in who are more experienced than he is, that know better, that are better than he is. He doesn't have to have yes men or yes women in him. He wants these sorts of people. Now, as much as her biography has received its just reward. The interesting thing, if I may say this, is when Ulysses S. Grant forms his cabinet, he says it didn't work. It didn't work. And I'm not going to follow that pattern. It didn't work at all. It became very dysfunctional. Salmon Chase in the cabinet was always out to get Lincoln, always trying to run against him. So you could look at it for both ways. Sadly, obviously today, we seem totally incapable, don't we, of having people from the other party. Sometimes in recent years we've had them, but they've usually been retired from the other party. I'm trying to think of the guy that's on television a lot these days, Bill, what's his name? Secretary of Defense, I think, a Republican, yeah. So, but she was onto something there. This says something for her, and I think true about who Abraham Lincoln was. He was secure in his own skin, and therefore he was willing to have people who were more knowledgeable than he was in certain areas.
Didn't he put somebody on the Supreme Court that was a rival?
Absolutely. Did he put someone on the Supreme Court who was a rival? I mean, Salmon Chase, I'd like to kick him in the shins, you know. This guy was always after Lincoln. He was going to run against Lincoln in 1864. And then the chief of the Supreme Court, who had been there for 7 presidents, dies. So Lincoln asks himself the question, well, who should I put on the Supreme Court? Well, the big issue was that they had passed the 13th Amendment, which is the basis of the movie Lincoln, which outlaws slavery forever. But Lincoln was terribly worried that a next president, we've seen this flip-flop in our time, have we not, could do away with this affirmation or advocacy for African Americans. Or maybe Congress would do away with it also. So, I've got to put someone as the Chief Justice who is strongly anti-slavery. So though I don't like Salmon Chase personally, he is strongly anti-slavery. So he nominates Salmon Chase, his longtime rival, to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Again, that says so much about Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. Was there another comment over here? Yes.
Yeah. As I understand it, Lincoln had this strong tendency when things were going wrong in the Civil War and presidency to basically accept the blame for that, sort of first. So do you think that that was the belief of the private Lincoln, or is that a political strategy of public Lincoln?
Good comment and question. The comment is that he's heard that when things were going wrong in the Civil War, Lincoln was very willing to accept the blame for it. I think this is the balance that I find in Lincoln, which is a difficult balance for any of us, certainly for a politician, between humility and ambition, between admitting I may not be right, this is my policy. I love the story that Lincoln was an avid newspaper reader. And there were many, many newspapers in those days, like 7 or 8 or 9 in Washington. So on a Sunday afternoon, the story goes, his secretaries tell us, he's reading the Sunday afternoon newspapers. He sends out for a newsboy to bring all the newspapers in. And as he's reading these newspapers, one after another, after another, after another, he finally says, Lincoln, you really are a dog. You know, he's hearing this in the newspaper. So I think this to me says something about who he is as a person, private and public, that he's willing to be. I love people who are willing to be self-deprecatory, in their humor, to poke fun at themselves. You have to be really a secure person to poke fun at yourself. And Lincoln was great at poking fun at himself. He's traveling in Illinois, and photography was only invented in 1838. And so the big deal, if you had a photographic studio, was you wanted in the front window to have the photograph of some famous person, which would then draw in the customers. So Lincoln's in this small town in Illinois, and this photographer comes up to him and says, I'd love to get a photo. We could do that. So he goes over to the photographer's studio, and the photographer gets everything set up, and he says, your hair is all messed up. He said, let me straighten out your hair. So he straightens out the hair, and when the guy gets back behind his camera, Lincoln goes, he said, people wouldn't recognize me. So the photograph is Lincoln's hair is just going everywhere. People wouldn't recognize me. That's not who I am. Yes, here we are.
I'm impressed that the neatness of Lincoln in his thought, his problem solving and his judgments. Can you make any kind of line from his youth to his early years that brought him there?
A wonderful, wonderful question. The question is that he is impressed with Lincoln's ability to be a problem solver. And could I make any discussion of what it might have been in Lincoln's early life or his experiences or his various jobs, or his education, that might have allowed him to be this problem solver? An interesting aspect of this, and I can't answer it fully, this is why I get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm still asking myself that question, is that as Lincoln is out on that 8th Judicial Circuit, now he's, let's see, 1850, he's in his early 40s. He decides that he's going to start studying Euclid's geometry. This is what a lawyer, all lawyers should study, Euclid's geometry. Why? Because he thinks that studying Euclid's geometry will help him understand how to problem solve, to use your phrase, that this will help him in his thinking. So he did turn to that. He also turned to some of the great orators of the day. He was terribly impressed. You may not like his politics, but he was very impressed with John C. Calhoun, very impressed with Daniel Webster, very impressed especially with Henry Clay. And Henry Clay, this is so phenomenal to me in what's going on in our politics today. Henry Clay ran for the presidency 3 times as a Whig. And in one of them, he should have won. But he lost New York because the ultra-abolitionists cast 16,000 votes for what the so-called Liberty Party, which was anti-slavery. And Lincoln comes down upon this later and says, I want to tell you this. These self-righteous people cost Henry Clay the presidency of the United States because they wanted to be right, and we lost one of the greatest Americans who's ever lived, Henry Clay. Now, if you go to Henry Clay's home in Kentucky called Ashland, you will see that he is called, this is a Whig who would have been a Republican, he is the great compromiser. Well, that wouldn't sell today at all. The great compromiser, because he had the ability to bring people together. He's the one who put in place the Compromise of 1850. The great compromiser. He believed that he had to work with people, quote unquote, across the aisle. And Lincoln took that as his model. That really is the predecessor of the team of rivals, that Henry Clay was the great compromiser who could work with people to get something done. He didn't always have to be right. And I think that was part of Lincoln's problem solving too. He didn't have to be right. But I would argue this one more question. I don't want to talk too long on this point. Lincoln, we might idealize him, he was a real wonder at party machinery. That's in the Lincoln movie. Boy, he would send out things he would always keep, in the notes you'll see he's keeping track of all the ballots, all the votes, all the chits that he's got out there. Okay, can you get me this vote? Can we do this? He understood the Republican machinery as well as anybody. He was really a shrewd politician. You can be a shrewd politician and be idealistic at the same time. Other comments or questions? Yes?
For all his ambition,
Right.
he always made it secondary to getting something done that would be good for the nation, it seemed to me.
Thank you, Joanne. Joanne's comment is that for all of his ambition, he always wanted to get something done for the nation. And Lincoln, behind this is a great trust and faith in the American people. He believed in the American people, in American democracy. He believed that what we were doing in the Civil War was not simply about the United States, it was about the whole world. This was called an experiment up until the Civil War. countries in Europe, this isn't going to last. You can't operate this way. I mean, today we hear Russia and China and other nations saying, you can't have a democracy, it's too messy. Well, Lincoln wanted to prove that this messy experiment could work. And one way he did that was he wasn't going to become a dictator. He wasn't going to become an authoritarian leader. He was going to trust the American people to do what was right. And so finally he makes the decision in the middle of the Civil War as commander-in-chief that now freedom must also be extended to African Americans. That he had thought at the beginning of the war, the beginning of the war, he's only fighting to save the Union. But he realizes that there is really no ultimate freedom until we have, as he says in the Gettysburg Address, a new birth of freedom. A new birth of freedom, yeah. Okay, I don't want to take too much time. You've got to get to the kickoff. No. one more, okay.
Quickly. Lincoln's nationalization of the railroad.
Ah.
An extension of the railroads is a key factor in the outcome.
Wow, absolutely.
Who did he think this up, or?
The comment, which is a great comment, is the fact of you're using the phrase nationalization of the railroad. What I think we're saying is Lincoln understood the whole revolution in communication. His first election was carried to California by Pony Express. By Pony Express. He understood the power of the telegraph. He understood the power of the railroad. He was a huge proponent of developing the railroad to the West Coast. He saw that the West was where this nation would be developed in the next century. He understood that. One of the most difficult decisions in his life was he was offered to be the governor of Oregon. The governor of Oregon. And he turned it down because he felt that he had a base of operation in Illinois and to sort of start all over again in Oregon. But he was very much, he talked with Mary at the end of his life about going both to California and to Israel, and to Palestine as they called it then. He was a person who, I like to say, thought in the future tense. He wasn't, one of his greatest State of the Union addresses, they didn't call it then, was in 1862, December, before the Emancipation Proclamation would be issued in January 1st of 1863. He says, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate for the stormy present." I wish I could ask him the question, what did he mean by the dogmas of the quiet past? But the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate for the stormy present, as our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. Now, this is a lawyer and a politician who valued precedent. He valued Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, but he said, our case is new. This is not the American Revolution. We must be willing to move forward and do new things. And I think this is, to me, again, a great challenge that we're really facing today. It's kind of underneath all of our conversation. Some of us want to go back. I mean, you and I can all remember how wonderful it was way back there and then. But on the other hand, how do we move and go forward? And Lincoln seemed to be able to balance those two, to relish the past, honor the past, as our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. Other comments or questions? How are we doing? Maybe about 5 more minutes. Yes?
The fragment suggests that really the core of his founding of republicanism was the slavery question.
Yes.
And the outrage of allowing a vote on something
Right.
so patently incompatible
Right.
with the Declaration.
Right.
We know the Republicans today as a conservative party. I read nothing in your description. There didn't seem to be any element in his thinking, at least as described in the book, of Burkean conservatism, say. or the idea of, oh, we're in this new world and we have to come up with, get rid of the old dogma and come with the new.
Yeah.
That sounds like a liberal or a progressive sentiment. Whereas somebody like Burke, who at that time was, you know, the great figure of
Right.
what you would now call conservatism.
Yeah.
How did that, do we know anything about how Lincoln thought about those issues?
The comment, wonderful comment, is where is Lincoln in this conversation between conservative and liberal? What would he think of Edmund Burke, who's kind of a great spokesperson for a conservative?
He must have read Burke.
Yeah. I think, first of all, it's very difficult to transpose liberal and conservative from the 19th century to the 21st century. It really changes. And Lincoln says it best. He's a wonderful person of storytelling. And so he tells a story of two men who were wrestling. And the more they wrestle out of each other's clothes until they're in the clothes of the other. And he makes the point of how things have changed from the federalism to the present. And so here, just think about it. In the 19th century, the Democratic Party was the party of states' rights. And the Republican Party was the party of a strong central government under Lincoln and Grant. And now it's exactly flipped. The Republican Party, especially in the South, is a party of states' rights. And the Democratic Party is a party of a strong central government. Not saying one is right or one is wrong, but history moves on. I'm very much worried whenever we use some historical, well, we did this in 1939 and we should have now. Well, that was 1939. No, that's not today. It's all quite different.
I mean, Burke made a big deal, and conservatives today still talk about
Oh, they do,
this,
sure.
over so-called prejudice and prescription, that you don't casually dismiss the old dogmas. That must be done with great care.
Yeah.
How did that principle affect, say, Lincoln versus Douglas?
Well, taking up your point again, that Burke makes this point that you don't casually dismiss old dogmas. So when I use that quotation, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate for the present, I'm not suggesting that in any way that Lincoln is sort of throwing away past ideas or past realities. He understands these, and
Nor would Burke.
Nor would Burke, and he values them. Yeah, he values them very much. But it's a question of trying to read the times, and this is very difficult for any of us. I often say that, good preaching is preaching with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. That's what Karl Barth said is good preaching, and I think this church does it remarkably well. Jessica, Eric, Tom Toole, my good friend Tom Toole. So how do you understand? I mean, this morning's sermon was such a phenomenal exercise in that. Jessica's remarkable insight into the meaning of friendship, I thought, was just terrific in terms of understanding the human situation and the human condition. And I think Lincoln understood that. This is where I like to say that Lincoln, he never formally joined the Presbyterian Church, but he was not a joiner. He spoke at many, many temperance societies. He was a teetotaler. He did not drink. But he never joined a temperance society. But Lincoln participated in 2 Presbyterian churches. And I think one reason he did was he thought Presbyterians were willing to kind of grapple with both the elements and foundations of the gospel, but also the society that was all around us. He liked thoughtful people. And Phineas Densmore Gurley, pastor of New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, was a thoughtful preacher. Student of Charles Hodge, #1 in his class at Princeton Seminary. And Lincoln was really taken by Phineas Densmore Gurley and so appreciated him. Yeah. One more comment or question, then you've got to run to the kickoff. Yes. Yeah.
Just forgive me, I want to read it so I don't flub my words. I read that Lincoln believed in emancipation, but not necessarily equality. He had a history of changing his views throughout his political career, I believe based on articles I've read. Initially campaigning for colonization, but then listening to black voices and abandoning that. He was against black people having the vote, but then changed his mind that black soldiers who fought in the Civil War should be able to have a vote at another point in his career. Do you think there's a precedent in your research that he ever fully embraced equality before he passed away? I ask this not knowing as much about his later years.
Well, the burden of your question is, what did Lincoln think about equality? But what you're also saying in your comment was Lincoln changed his mind.
A lot of history of
A lot of things. And so even as I want to talk next week more about his Christian faith or his religious faith, historians haven't given him credit for changing his mind. Well, first of all, and this is so hard to say, and it's very difficult for young people to understand, let's put Lincoln as a 19th century person. He can't help us with climate change. He can't help us with what to do in Ukraine. The idea of social equality was not even in the ballpark. Even the most radical abolitionists almost none of them would grant social equality. The idea that people would marry from one race to another, not possible. So the question is, where does Lincoln fit on that spectrum? I think he fits moving a little bit left of center. Yes, originally he was for what was called the colonization movement. The American Colonization Society was founded in 1817. Again, very much misunderstood in the recent debate. Many of the founders of this were African Americans. They wanted to go back to Liberia and other parts of Africa and missionize Africa. They wanted the people who were their family members to have the benefit of the Christian faith. But it's been just blasted in the last 5 to 7 years as a racist organization. Well, you can do that, but you'd have to take away all kinds of great African American leaders who were part of the American Colonization Society. So Lincoln did say all the way up to 1862, I'm not sure that blacks and whites can live together in this society. I'm not sure. He said this in the most difficult moment of all. He had a conversation with 7 black leaders in August of 1862, and he said to them, I'm not sure that we can live together in this country. But in that same month, he writes the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. This country must change. He said when he signed it, this will be remembered by me as the greatest thing I have ever done in my life. Signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It was very, very unpopular. Union soldiers did not join this war to fight with black soldiers. They didn't want to fight with black soldiers at all. 180,000 black soldiers would join the Union Army. And Lincoln, persuaded by Grant, understood that these black men who had been cowed their whole life could be courageous soldiers. And they were. So was Lincoln willing to learn? He abandoned that colonization program. He stepped into emancipation. In his debates with Stephen Douglas, Douglas called him, I was talking with Molly about this before the lecture. In the first 2 debates, Stephen Douglas called Lincoln a black Republican 29 times. 29 times. So Lincoln says, at the beginning of the 4th debate, well, I'm not asking that this black woman be socially equal to me, but in her right to earn bread from her own hand, she's every bit my equal. So he's kind of doing a treadwell here. He's kind of balancing, he's on a seesaw. He's working this thing out as he debates it. This is a very difficult issue. He is being called a black Republican. What's hard to understand, again, is that the abolitionists, who we now in many ways correctly kind of lift up and praise, they were viewed in that day as really a bunch of extremists, really way, way to the left. And so Lincoln was put off by a lot of them. He was anti-slavery. I'll close with this story and then we've got to stop. After the Emancipation Proclamation, most of the blacks who served in the Union Army came from the South. That's where they lived. And so the governor of Kentucky was very upset by this, and he wrote 3 letters to Lincoln. He said, do you realize what you're doing? You're destroying the agriculture of my state. All the blacks who are working on our farms are leaving to join the Union Army. So finally, the governor, who is so upset with Lincoln, says, I'm coming to see you in person. And I'm bringing a former United States senator and the editor of our leading newspaper. So Lincoln says, fine, let's meet together. So they meet on Saturday morning, March 26, 1864. And Lincoln starts out and he says these words, not to three men from Massachusetts, but to three men from Kentucky. I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. Wow. I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. To me, this is the heart of Abraham Lincoln. These men didn't want to hear that at all. That's not who they were. They were very much pro-slavery, but Lincoln, in a very honest way, writes this, says this to them. The editor was so taken by it, he writes about 3 weeks later, and he said, this is the most amazing thing. Would you be willing to write down what you said? Well, Lincoln says, I said it spontaneously. I didn't write it down then, but I'll write it down for you. And so then it's published in a newspaper. You've been great. As the airlines say, you have many options on a Sunday afternoon. Thank you very much.